Today on episode number 159 of the Teaching in Higher Ed podcast, Todd Zakrajsek shares about his new book, Dynamic Lecturing. Produced by Innovate Learning, maximizing human potential. Welcome to this episode of Teaching in Higher Ed. I'm Bonnie Stahoviak, and this is the space where we explore the art and science of being more effective at facilitating learning. We also share ways to improve our personal productivity so we can have more peace in our lives and be even more present for our students. Todd, welcome back to Teaching in Higher Ed.
I appreciate it being here, Bonnie.
If people have been listening for a while, they know that usually this is the point in the show where I paraphrase or directly read word for word someone's bio. But you and I decided not to do that this time because people can always go look at it at the show notes, of course, at teachinginhighered.com/159. However, we thought it might just be fun to catch up a little bit with you. What's going on in your life right now? What you been up to lately?
Lots of things. At the university, I'm associate director of a fellowship program with 16 early career doctors, and they spend 5 weeks in Chapel Hill, and they just left last week. Just a great group of individuals, so that was fun. Kind of working on the second book of the Excellent Teacher series through Stylus, and that one is on the syllabus. And then also working now on the third book in the series, which is looking at educational concepts, what some of the educational, psychological, foundational concepts that are in teaching and learning that people may not know about. So working on those, and the second edition of the New Science of Learning with Terry Doyle. So excited about that. And then kind of traveling around and doing some workshops here and there. So having a good time kind of visiting campuses and helping out with teaching and learning issues.
I know on one of your recent trips, you actually got to learn something about your name, that which I would think would be kind of unexpected on a trip. Will you tell us about that?
Well, yeah, it was kind of an interesting thing. I got an opportunity to go to University of Maribor in Slovenia, and Slovenia is the origin of my name. And my grandfather had told me my entire life that I said Zakrajsek wrong. And so I just never knew how to pronounce my own last name. And so it turns out, Bonnie, just in the nick of time, because you've learned how to say Zakrajsek, that's not actually correct. I'm so sorry.
All right, so I'm ready for the new lesson. I have to unlearn so I can relearn, yes.
All right, the closest I can come to Todd Zakrajsek in Slovenian is Todd Zakrajsek. So there we go.
Am I rolling my R there?
It's a little bit as a Zakrajsek.
Zakrajsek. Zakrajsek.
Oh, that's very close. Yes, very close.
And are you going to be changing now how you pronounce your last name?
No, I think it's mean.
Okay. I was telling you how comfortable I felt having you back on the show, and that I didn't even have to look up how to pronounce your name. It's just it rolls right off the tongue, and then I already know you and feel so comfortable talking with you. I don't have to have the nerves like I sometimes do. So that would have been a little mean, but yeah, I could have handled it though, because it's good for us to exercise our brain plasticity.
Yes, and what I do like to now tell people, I had all these great phonetic spellings, is if you just change the J, which messes people up, to a long I, then it's just Zakrajsek. It's kind of how it looks. And so the Americanized version actually works. It's just, so I'm gonna let this go for a few years, and maybe periodically when I need to sound fancy, I can throw it in there.
Yeah, and then make people start questioning themselves. Oh my gosh, have I been calling him the wrong name the whole time?
That's right, I'll have to do that. But no, we're gonna try the Americanized version. It's been several years trying to get people rolling on that name. I think we leave it alone for a while.
Todd, I am spending a little bit of time this summer writing a book, and the topic is productivity. And it's been making me chuckle a little bit at myself because it's one of those words that I think people either gravitate toward, like, oh, I'd love to get better at that, or they find it revolting. That's a whole, there's a lot of baggage, I guess, that comes with that topic. And I'm thinking that your new book has a lot of baggage with it as well. Can you tell me a little bit about what sort of baggage goes along sometimes with talking about lecturing?
Oh, yes. So when I pitched the concept of dynamic lecturing, I can't say that the publishing firm, Stylus has got great books, and they have a lot of good progressive books. And so when I told John, hey, what about a book on lecturing? The immediate response wasn't, this is a great idea. And the concept, of course, being out there is that pretty much everybody's talking about how ineffective lectures are and that we shouldn't be lecturing. And I've really felt that that's unfair. And so I thought it'd be a good idea that we actually talk about lecturing. And when I started looking at the literature that's out there, there's not a lot of books about lectures. There's not a lot of conference presentations about lectures. And by and large, it's come to have a bad name. So I thought, why not write a book about it and shed a little bit of light on this topic?
What part of lecturing getting a bad name is appropriate? I mean, where have the criticisms actually turned out to be valid?
Well, there are some places, but I think we have to be really careful because the problem is you can't just take bad examples of something and then claim that the whole concept is bad. And so one of the things I've been saying recently, and I really believe this is true, it's overall, if bad teaching were considered a crime, I think we've arrested the wrong suspect. Because what we'll do is we look at lecturing and say, oh, look at this terrible lectures and the students aren't learning anything and we shouldn't be lecturing. Well, the problem is we shouldn't be lecturing poorly. So when we stop to think about what do you really mean by a lecture? And I think what happens is conjured up in people's minds very quickly is kind of a wiry-haired old professor standing behind a lectern with yellow notes who just pontificates for an entire class period. And it goes over the top of students' heads and they're bored and it's monotone and it's just awful. And if that's the concept of a bad lecture, we shouldn't do that. In fact, that isn't, I shouldn't say if it's a concept of a bad lecture, that is a bad lecture. We shouldn't do that. But storytelling is one of the most effective ways that humans communicate with one another. And so if we take a storytelling approach, a lecture can be good. But again, I think we need to move away from the concept. I mean, we need to talk about what good lectures are, and that's what this book will do. But there's other things we should look at, and that's what's good pedagogy, what's good teaching, and what's bad teaching.
What then is a lecture, and what are just a few different examples of what form a lecture might take? Well, we have definitely the formal lecture that's out there. And so that's the one that we have to be careful of. And there's good data out there that suggests that if you're lecturing all the time with a formal or a paper reading lecture, it's not going to work. But there's also other types of lectures. There's storytelling lectures, discussion lectures, lectures that use audio visual or visual things, movie clips. There's demonstration lectures, interactive lectures. There's lots of different types of lecturing that involve not just talking all the time in a way where a person's just reading from a script. One of the contrasts that I see showing up a lot is the idea that if we were to think of all of this on a continuum, that lecturing is all the way over on one side of this continuum and what we call active learning is all the way on the other side of this continuum. Is that an appropriate way of gauging these things, or do we need to put that model on the shelf or in the trash?
Yeah, I think the trash will be fine. I've seen a lot of people do this, and I don't know what the continuum, I guess what it means is that you're going all the way from one-way passive learning all the way over to a very engaged active learning. And so now we've got this passivity, one-way communication versus interactive, engaged activity. So let me just take a second and rant and rave about this one for a little bit here. If we do that, what we're basically saying is this one side over here that's the one-way communication, and what most people will say is you can't really learn from that. When you sit back and listen to a lecture, it's like that proverbial little, that image that's out all over the place with the little watering can and the teacher's pouring knowledge into the brain. That's the one-way communication. So let's try this for just a second. Let's imagine that one-way communication doesn't work, okay? You can't just sit back and have information one way put onto you and then you suddenly learn something. If that's the case, we would claim lecturing doesn't work. But if you take the lecture and write it out and then hand it to somebody, especially if it's edited, that would look a lot like a book. So the same argument would have to be made as that we can't learn from a book, which starts to make me feel really nervous. If you videotape a lecture, a person wandering across the stage and using good hand gestures and good stories and really talking through what's happening, that's kind of like a monologue from maybe a theater production or from a movie. And now you're going to tell me that we can't possibly learn from a monologue in a movie or even a movie itself or from a book because it's one-way communication. I'm never going to buy that you can't learn from a book and you can't learn from a movie. Oh, and by the way, TED Talks tend to be lectures. and people seem to like those. So the point here is I'm kind of gone off on a long spin for this one, but that idea of simply because it's one-way communication, you can't learn from it, I think breaks down really fast.
One of the things that comes up for me a lot when I start thinking about becoming better at lecturing is when I think about, I've gotten to see you speak a number of times, and I really admire you as a presenter. You're hysterical. You keep my attention really well. You are a brilliant storyteller, and you bring in so many concrete examples that make what you're trying to pass on to your audience so tangible that we can do something with it. You also, I really have enjoyed giving time for us to reflect on things. And so it's been fun, but I guess what I want to explore with you a little bit is to what extent, as we are observing really great speakers or watching a TED Talk, like you mentioned, how much should we be thinking about emulating others? And then where is there kind of a danger in doing that so that we don't really leverage our own strengths? And just to give one example of that, Todd, I don't consider myself naturally funny. I end up being my most funny when I'm not trying to be like, I trip over things that are hysterical. And then that, I think that that's a better thing for me than to try to be funny in front of an audience of 1,000 or what have you. So what do you think about that as far as emulating others versus leveraging our own strengths?
Well, number one, I think most people are the funniest when they're not even trying to be funny. I think that's what, to me, really good humor is just the naturally funny stuff that comes out. The canned kind of jokes that you drop into certain places, those can be funny. And I know that some people do it very, very well, but that's not what I really enjoy. Actually, I have to say, one time person wrote an evaluation for me as, I don't think he's as funny as he thinks he is.
Oh, no.
And my very first thought was, how would they know?
Yeah.
How do they have a clue how funny I think I am? But I was having a good time.
Yeah.
So the concept here is the number one rule I would give anybody in terms of humor in teaching, I'll start there, is if you are not funny, which some people just naturally are not, it doesn't come across well to try to be funny. You can try some small things, but you have to be really careful with that. I think it comes back to a lot of what Parker Palmer has always said, is that you just need to be authentic. So a person needs to be who they are. And if you can do that, that's the first huge step. Now, from there, I think one of the big issues we got to keep in mind, and it's kind of something I've been playing around with recently, is that we always have to be mindful of how attentive the audience is at any given moment. And when I say audience here, I mean if you're doing a faculty development workshop, then it's perhaps faculty members. If you're working in a hospital, it may be residents. If you're working in an undergraduate institution, it'll be students. But whomever it is that you're speaking to, are they attending to you at the moment that you're kind of looking around the room and at any given moment? And so I think that's where lecturing also gets a bad rap, is that a person who doesn't do that monitoring, are the folks really attending to what I'm saying, will oftentimes go off and then people lose interest, they lose focus, they're not paying attention, then it's not a good strategy. But if humor is something that you can use well, you use that to draw attention. If you're a good storyteller, you do stories. If you're really good at laying out a concept, you do that. But if you are genuinely interested in what you're doing, it's amazing how much interest there is in the person watching you talk about it.
How much of what you have to teach us about lecturing is about us being better at planning the lecture? And then how much of it is about us being better at responding to a lack of attention, engagement, and being in the moment to capitalize on things that come out more spontaneously?
Well, that's a tough combination to talk about. I mean, I think what it really comes down to, I'd say, is there's some basic learning principles. And if you're going to be good at lecturing, you have to hit those basic principles. So, and I hadn't mentioned, I'm so sorry, I should have done this earlier, is Christine Harrington's actually the first author on this book. So what Christine and I have done is put together some kind of framed this whole concept of effective lecturing, dynamic lecturing, around these psychological principles. So what we really want to be looking for is, yes, there's some structural things you can do, but by and large, you want to do things like activating prior knowledge. If in your lecture you can find ways to activate the prior knowledge that a person has that helps them tie the information you're giving them to their old information, which helps them to remember it. You want to capture and maintain attention. That's another one of the chapters in the book. And the idea there is if you can get the attention, however you do that, with a good anecdote, a metaphor, a story, or whatever you do, and then do something to maintain the attention, that's valuable. But what we know from psychology and learning is you have to have attention. We have to use or do things like making it meaningful. If there's nothing useful to it, people are going to tune out. So somehow when you're lecturing, you have to demonstrate the utility or the value of it. But if you can activate that prior knowledge, maintain their attention, and make sure that it has some utility to it, that's foundationally going to be very, very good. And then you can step back also and look at things like mechanics. And let me take just a second it's one of my favorite things is the human brain is actually wired to look for things that change. New information comes from new things. If something is stagnant, if something is just a repetitive piece of information, it loses value because I know already what it is. And so one of the statements I've been using many times when I do workshops is, let's just say you're walking down a path and you see a tree. As you walk by the tree, you'll notice that you'll glance over and see the tree, and then you stop looking at it and you walk by because the tree has no new information. It's not going to do anything, so you don't need to attend to it. If, however, you're walking down the path and you glance over and see a puma. Now, a puma doesn't stay still. So as you walk by the puma, even if you do walk by it, you would watch it very, very carefully. And the reason you watch it carefully is it's unpredictable. You don't know what the next piece of information will be. Will it lunge at you? Will it run away? What's going to happen? And so what I've told many people is you should teach like a puma, not like a tree. And the concept here is that we want to have new information coming. And so the brain, for instance, habituates to or shuts down to constant stimuli, which is the reason that monotones are really hard to listen to. And that is because it's a constant piece of information. It doesn't fluctuate. So when a person starts teaching and says to you that there's 14 things that we're going to be needing doing, it takes all of about 10 seconds for your brain to actually start shutting down on that. So yes, mechanics like varying your voice, walking around the room, using your hands in good gestures, and structures like storytelling and metaphors. And then, of course, overall learning principles like activating prior knowledge and capturing attention and making it meaningful. Those all come together, and that's what makes a good lecture.
One of the reasons why I almost always have two people on each episode of the show is for that very reason. That you picture most people listen to podcasts when they're on the go or they're doing something that requires less brain function, such as washing dishes or folding the laundry, etc. And a lot of the research, it was mostly around radio, but was that you're going to pay a lot more attention to it if there are two different voices. And those podcasts actually that have two voices that sound very similar, that's something that the audience often complains about, that there's not enough different about those voices to keep grabbing their attention back. So it's one of the reasons we do that. I also wanted to share that it can seem a little bit overwhelming in terms of if people have a short amount of time that they're going to be able to speak on a topic. I know for me, teaching 50-minute classes is really rough because that just flies by, that you can do these things at the same time. And I've seen you do that before. So I have seen you both activate prior knowledge at the same time that you're capturing and maintaining my attention, and at the same time that you're making it meaningful. And one of the ways I've seen you do that is by sharing some data that you've collected around whatever topic it is that you are sharing about. But instead of just sharing it, you ask your audience to predict what we think it's going to be. And sometimes I've seen you do that where we actually literally would like vote in some way. It could just be even, raise your hand or lift a piece of paper or talk to someone sitting next to you and predict together what you think it'll be. But that just brings me back in because I already came to your talk, so it's meaningful to me, whatever it is you're saying. But the act of having me predict before you share the information just really, really grabs attention.
Well, I'm really glad you brought that up, Bonnie, because the real hook in the book that we have for this dynamic lecturing, see, that was cool.
I like it.
I said, okay, I'm going to admit this one, although you can't tell anybody, okay?
Just between you and me.
Just between you and I. See, whispering, that's a different voice level.
Yes,
that's good. Every chapter finishes with engagement strategies. And so the concept is when the chapter on, for instance, activating prior knowledge, at the end of the chapter was lecture enhancement strategies. And what this means is that if you're lecturing along on activating prior knowledge, this is an important thing to do. And oh, by the way, here's some ways of getting the students involved in it. And so that's going to be in there. So just like what you were just saying, that concept of making you predict something, when a person makes a prediction, especially when they share it with somebody else, they become more vested in what the answer is because to some extent, they want to know if they're right. Some people want to know if they're more right than the other person. And so the concept is it becomes a game. And so just taking a second or two and you're saying, okay, we're going to share this information on what percentage of the students do you think actually completed this developmental math class when they were taught how to learn versus just taught the strategies in the class. And the audience will start to make estimates of what percentage they think it is. Some people will say maybe 5%, maybe 30%, maybe 10%. And at that point, right there, they become more interested in hearing what the actual answer is. If I just state it, 19% of the people are more likely to complete the course. It's just a piece of information and it kind of flows through.
The other thing I really enjoyed about the book, not just the end of chapter summaries, which are always great, and the ability to actually apply it, but at the very end, or toward the very end, you have all of that consolidated again. So around the activating prior knowledge, capture and maintain attention, I can plan out my lecture with those things in mind. But then also you've sparked for me, here are some different approaches you could use, because you wouldn't want to be so predictable that every single time you tried to do this part of your lecture, you always used this approach. You give something like 7 or so different approaches that we can use in actually planning that out. And I think that's really going to be a helpful resource to people who pick up the book.
Well, and you've hit another part that's really important too, is when we look at engagement types of strategies, we have to be careful. Most faculty figured this out very quickly, is those have to be varied as well. If you're going to use a think, pair, share, it can work really, really well. But if every class 2 or 3 times you say, okay, think, pair, share, okay, think, pair, share, okay, think, pair, share, see, even there it becomes redundant. So we do need a kind of a multitude of strategies so we can mix it up a little bit.
That's also one of those phrases I've never been a big fan of. I use the approach all the time, but my gosh, that's a very overused one. So you'll never hear me actually uttering those words when I'm doing it. Yeah. Because then it all seems a little bit too practiced and a little bit too rote, and then I think people don't realize that like this is actually a really important part of what we're doing here together.
Mm-hmm. Well, it is. And this actually comes down to, so if we could get to the real meat of what we're discussing here, here's I think a really, really important concept. Here it is. The big important concept is what we really should be talking about is cognitive load all the time. And what I mean by cognitive load is there's a theory out there of this cognitive load is it's kind of like your working RAM. It's what at any given moment the information you can process. You see that the kind of the sensory memory is almost unlimited. You can look at a whole football stadium and close your eyes, and for about a quarter of a second, you have the whole stadium in your mind. So it's very short in duration, but it's pretty well unlimited in scope of what it can take in. Then there's the long-term memory that I don't know of any report out there other than the Far Side cartoon where a person's brain is reported to be full. So nobody fills their brain, which is actually kind of amazing. The problem is there are times we have all felt it where we say, whoa, right now I cannot process any new information. That's the spot we got to watch for, because when we're teaching, if I'm an expert and you're a novice and I'm pushing a whole bunch of new information, there's going to come a point where your little meter is going to go to the top and say, I'm full right now and I can't do anymore. So that's the point where we do an activity or an engagement strategy. So what we're going to do is I might lecture for 15 minutes, say, all right, everybody, now get into groups of 4, and we're going to come up with 3 applications for this. When I do that, what I've actually done is given people an opportunity to practice and to try this, but I've reduced their cognitive load. And by doing that, it means when I come back with new information, they can then absorb it. So active learning strategies are not the breaks we take because people get bored from lecture. It's the glue, it's the solidification of the new information that allows us to then move forward with more new information. So cognitive load, and when we're maxed out, we stop and do something with the information. I think that's where we should be looking.
What are one of the ways that we can enhance our lectures that most people don't make use of in your experience?
I think that the biggest way we can enhance the lectures is to do something with the information. I mean, and that's the push that we're all trying to make right now in education, is to these engagement kinds of strategies. But what happens then is you say, okay, here's a new piece of information. You've been learning for the last 10 minutes. Now let's do something with it. Let's reflect on it. Let's apply it. Let's think about it in a new way. Teach it to your neighbor. Come up with a new concept. When you do that, essentially what's happening is you're making the lecture effective because the student now can take the information and do something with it, which we know is going to help them remember it later. And what's really important about this is when someone says, yeah, but I have so much content to cover. This is the reason that you have to actually insert those engagement learning strategies. If we consider those engagement strategies to be something that allows the students to take a break because they get bored or they're not paying attention, or we're going to take a stretch, that feels like wasted time. But if the engagement strategies are in there to help us to actually solidify the information and to make the learning through lecturing more effective, then they're not something that can be cut out. So people would no longer say, yeah, but I have so much content, I can't do engagement strategies. I have to lecture all the time. No, because of, again, with cognitive load, you lose people. So the most important thing we can always keep in mind with lecturing is, are you keeping the attention? Are they understanding? And they finding this useful? And that will happen up to a point. And when you start to lose them, you got to shake it up and do something else.
I know why you are a person who got selected to or proposed a book about dynamic lecturing. And it does make me curious, though, is there anything in the writing and research process that either you or Christine uncovered that was a surprise to either of you?
Yes. Yeah, there was one small thing that really kind of surprised me. I can't find any evidence that says that lecturing is bad, which caught me off guard because a lot of people talk about it. I know about Scott Freeman's meta-analysis. In fact, that is a massively important publication. It's a meta-analysis of active learning strategies. And Freeman was actually in a session that I was the facilitator for, and I was so glad I didn't know he was in the audience when I was presenting. Because I cited his work and then said, hey, this doesn't say that lecturing's bad. It says that if you lecture all the time, it's bad. And it says mixing things up and adding engagement strategies makes it better. But that doesn't mean that lecturing's bad. And he at the end came up and we chatted for a little bit and he said, yes, you're absolutely right. And so think about it this way. Imagine for a moment that I'm dieting. I'm dieting. I've reduced my calories. I'm eating really healthy. And then we find out that if I start exercising, the exercising process makes it even more effective. I'm doing really, really well. At that point, we would never say, hey, look, exercise is good and dieting is bad. We would say the fact that you added the exercising to the nutritional eating has resulted in good health outcomes. We have been lecturing for 1,000 years, and we've figured out that if we add active learning strategies to it, it enhances the learning process. Where is the process that says that the first part, the lecturing, was bad? What we're saying is adding engagement strategies makes it better. And that somehow has gotten translated into lecturing's bad. And so what I was surprised is digging through tons of research and looking at all these articles. And what everybody shows is that when you add active and engaged learning strategies, you tend to get better outcomes. But it doesn't say that when you lecture for 5 minutes or 10 minutes and add an engagement strategy, that the lecturing is bad. In fact, there is some research that shows that a 5 or 10 minute lecture followed by engagements actually better outcomes than all engagement.
What have I not asked you about dynamic lecturing that I should be sure to before we go to the recommendation segment?
You've asked such good, insightful questions. I'm amazed at how well this has gone. I had to do that. I just had to do that, Bonnie. I think you're fabulous. No, I think you've covered it very well. I think that you've asked about the surprises, and that was the big thing on the lecturing thing. And perhaps you could ask me the biggest takeaway.
Oh, yeah. What's the biggest takeaway from the book?
Yeah, I think the big takeaway from the book is dynamic lecturing is really about adding these engagement strategies with it. And the concept here is it's research-based. It's got really good foundational work in it. But what we keep saying over and over again is when you do these things, it's good. And when you want to enhance it and make it better, you will still bring in these other things, which I think here's one big one I do want to leave the readers with. There is no value in looking at a person, a faculty member. Let's say a faculty member has been teaching for 20 years. There is no value in looking at that person who has been teaching through the lecture method for 20 years and saying lecturing is bad. What you're actually saying to that person is for 20 years, you've been hurting or harming people, and you need to do something completely different. The research doesn't support that. What you could do is look at the faculty member and say, hey, You've been lecturing for 20 years. Good for you, first of all, for being a teacher, and congratulations on all the good work you have done. If you want to do it a little bit better, here's some engagement strategies that you can add to those lectures you're doing, and here's a few ways to anchor your lectures. But let's honor and respect the people who have been working so hard instead of picking off a couple of really bad examples of bad lectures and saying anyone who does something that has this name is doing bad stuff. That's a huge takeaway.
I am so glad that I thought to ask you that last question. Ha ha ha. But also, in all seriousness, that really did bring it home for me, because more of my work now is in faculty development. And that just really inspires me to think about the importance of honoring what has gone on in the past, and that you don't have to completely change everything that you've been doing. You can add to it and enrich it that much more. I really like that. Thank you so much for that last piece.
You're welcome.
Well, this is the point in the show where we get to recommend things, and I know that we are both going to recommend something that doesn't have very much at all, if anything, to do with lecturing. I wanted to share that I really found a small tool that seemed like it wouldn't make that much of a difference, but has made a tremendous difference to me. We have in our home what I refer to as a command center. Have you ever heard that before, that expression? Like in someone's kitchen, they might have a little section called a command center. Have you heard of that expression, Todd, before?
No, I've not heard that expression.
So my husband is from the Midwest and also had never heard of that expression and laughed at me the first time I ever said it, as we were married and living together, and I moved into a new house and I wanted to have a command center in our closet of all things. And he's like, what on earth? It's not like you're like flying a spaceship or something. Yeah. It's a place to put your purse and put your phone and all that stuff. But I laugh because if you Google that, you will indeed see from Pinterest many, many pictures of these command centers where people can charge things and put their purses and pay bills and all that stuff. So in my command center, I tend to get rather messy. And the iPad comes home and gets plugged in, and the phone does, and then all of a sudden there's clothes that are folded but need to be put away. And it just becomes a source of clutter. And I think I discovered the reason why is that I didn't have a place to put those things. So I bought a pretty inexpensive charging stand. And what it does is it's just about, 6 by 10 inches or something like that. And it has all of my devices leaning instead. So picture my phone on its side leaning against a little plastic insert. And then the iPad, I also have a Kindle. You can tell I have a lot of plastic gadgets, the headphones, but they all have a little place, a little slot to go in. And it just completely, it's transformed it. I no longer have a mess there because things have a place where they can go. So I would strongly recommend people look into these charging stands. Maybe the kind that I got might not be the best for you, but it clears it up for me. It keeps things from getting so cluttered, and I'm a lot less likely to forget to charge something overnight that I really am going to want to use the next day. So I like these charging stations. I think they're a great way for us to keep ourselves from being so cluttered, and that's my recommendation for today.
Wow, that's a good one. I like that. Kind of everything has its place and every place has a thing.
I will tell you, I'm a pretty messy person when things don't have a place. And as soon as they do, I'll keep with that system for decades to come. So I really do like whenever everything has its place. I'm big into that. So
that's good. Well, my recommendation actually does have something to do with teaching.
Oh, good.
So, unlike you who just drifts off into any direction you feel like, mine is the Dark Sky app for my phone. And the Dark Sky app does cost a couple dollars, so I will admit that, and I get no royalties. I have no stake in this whole thing. But I love this app, and it's a weather app. And the thing I like about it mostly, aside from having some really good satellite images on it, the big one is it has a little grid when it's raining, and it tells you how hard it's going to rain and when it's going to stop, when it's going to start, with really good accuracy. And the reason I say it's teaching related is, when you're getting ready to walk out of your building and go over to another building to teach your class, and at least this is what it's like in North Carolina, is that it can be like raining cats and dogs. It's coming down hard. And I can pull out my Dark Sky app and it may say something like rain stopping in 5 minutes. Or I could look outside and see it's really threatening looking and it might say heavy rain starting in 10 minutes. Well, if it's a 5-minute walk to where I'm going, I grab myself and my stuff and run, even if I'm going to get there a little early. And the number of times that I have run across campus with people asking me if they could stop and ask me a question, and I said, no, I'm sorry, it's going to start raining in 2 minutes. And they'll laugh at me. Then I get into the building and 2 minutes later, this big rain shower comes. Then they stop laughing. And then the other one, of course, is if you're sitting in your car, you bolt for the house or you're running into a building or something, you can get drenched in a matter of a couple seconds. So what I'll do is pull out the app and look at it. And if it says heavy rain stopping in 5 minutes, I sit in my car and I do email for 5 minutes and then I get on my car and walk in. So my teaching related component is don't show up to your class soaking wet. Use dark sky.
And that would provide even more dynamic lectures.
It would, because nobody likes to watch a person give a lecture when they're sopping wet.
I know that this show is going to be airing much sooner than we usually air the episodes, and it might be possible people can't get it yet, but they should do what, Todd, if they want to get their hands on the book as soon as possible?
Actually, I believe that they're available for pre-sale right now. It should be out, I am told, mid to late July, so probably about, it won't be too long, but yes, should be out soon, and you can still just order it and then have it delivered. The cool thing about buying a book pre-sale is that often, at least this is me, I got a little bit of the ADD, I forget that I ordered it, and then all of a sudden one day a book shows up, and it's like someone got me a surprise.
I have the same thing. I have the exact same thing. My husband asked me about a purchase that I made, which I probably won't share so I can save it for a future recommendation. But he's like, I saw this show up. Is this an actual charge that, or is this a falsified charge? Yeah. Oh, no, that's me buying myself a present for back to school. It's like, we're nowhere near back to school. But by the time it gets to me, it's going to be brand new. I'll completely forget that it ever happened.
See, I think that's it. I think more people, if you want a little bit of spark in your life, that's maybe the other little side tips we'll give is order a back ordered item. And then just when it shows up, you can be surprised.
Thanks so much for coming on the show for the third time, Todd. And I am so looking forward to the next time we get to have a conversation like this about your next book. I'm just always love the conversations with you and your generosity to contribute to our learning.
Well, I appreciate that. And we'll have a couple of opportunities because this excellent teacher series through Silas is 10 books and Dynamic Lecture is number 1. So there will be 9 more books coming over the next 3 years.
Looking forward to it. And thanks for all your work, too, on the Lilly conferences. I've really enjoyed both the years I've gotten a chance to go.
It's always great when you're there, and I appreciate you mentioning that. And I look forward to the next time our professional paths cross again.
It was great having another conversation with Todd Zakrajsek. Sorry, Todd. I'm going to be thinking about that for a long time to come now. I'm going to need additional lessons or just go back to the way we were. So thanks so much again to Todd for being on today's show. If you want to have a look at the show notes where you can see some of the things that Todd and I referenced, especially that great app that can help us from walking in the rain and arriving to our classes soaked, you can go to teachinginhighered.com/159. And if you don't want to have to remember to do that, feel free to join the weekly email. That's just a single email that comes into your inbox. And that'll have all the show notes with the links that automatically come through, as well as a blog post that I write either on the subject about teaching or productivity, the 2 goals of this show. And if you'd like to subscribe, you can do that at teachinginhighered.com/subscribe. And when you subscribe, you'll also receive the Ed Tech Essentials guide that has 19 tools for how to use technology in your teaching, including some of the things that Todd talked about as far as enhancing your dynamic lectures. So you can subscribe at teachinginhighered.com/subscribe. See you next time.